Dear friends, tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the work with Novalis and fairy tale that we have been doing in our local Fair Oaks group of friends and members of the section for the literary arts and humanities. Now, this work occurs during the crisis time of COVID, and the crisis and our work with Novalis are very much related. I'll be speaking tonight within the context of the German literary tradition, but this is not to imply that the German fairy tale stands in any privileged position vis-a-vis other literatures. So first, to get us started, a little information about the section work in Fair Oaks. As many of you know, we've been meeting regularly for a decade, and our meetings were always quite personal. And then the COVID crisis happened. And like everyone, we were stopped in our tracks. For a couple of weeks in March 2020, we weren't sure how or if we could continue to meet. We were confused, like everyone else. But then one of our group members came forward with a question. She asked, "Is there a book or an author whose work might give us inspiration and healing impulses during these challenging times?" Of course, my thoughts went immediately to Novalis. I've had a strong personal connection to Novalis for decades, and I did much of my doctoral work on Novalis and his contemporaries. I am greatly inspired by Novalis in my own creative writing. So immediately when the question came forward, I suggested that we turn our attention to Novalis and that we meet on Zoom and that we work with the novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen, in which we find 3 important fairy tales by Novalis, including the famous Klingsor fairy tale in Chapter 9. This novel of the Blue Flower also contains many of Novalis's important insights about fairy tale, poetry, and dream. In fact, the entire novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen is much like a dream or a fairy tale. Novalis placed a great deal of importance on fairy tales, and he saw them as the highest form of literary art. So when the COVID crisis hit, Novalis entered our group work in Fair Oaks. And like I said, my personal experience with Novalis has been that if you spend time with Novalis in a serious way, and if you read his writings, and by that I mean if you read what Novalis actually wrote, and not just what others wrote about him, then you receive a great deal of inspiration for creativity and renewal. And this seems to have happened for our group in Fair Oaks. Aside from the inspiration we received from his writings, 2 things came directly and immediately out of our work with Novalis in 2020. Neither of these 2 things would have happened otherwise. No way. I am completely certain about that. The first, as I mentioned, is a website for the local group, theliteraryarts.com. This is a website where the local section group in Fair Oaks can store the meeting summaries and maintain a record of its work and artistic projects. Our hope is that the visibility of this website will inspire other friends and members of the section to be inspired to do things and to make those things known to other people, and that the work will continue and go outward into the world. The second thing that arose directly from the work with Novalis was an enlivened interest in fairy tale, or Märchen, as they are called in German. As I said, Novalis thought very highly of fairy tale, and much of what he says about the spiritual importance of fairy tale is echoed by Rudolf Steiner more than 100 years after Novalis died, which is entirely in keeping with the extreme importance that Steiner gave to Novalis, for example, in Steiner's last address. Novalis and Goethe, in a certain intimate and deeply esoteric literary sense, are harbingers and inspiring geniuses of anthroposophy, as Steiner tells us. And the fairy tale was equally valued by Novalis and Goethe as a sophisticated art form for adults. Now, to return to our theme, the healing art of fairy tale. I've always been fascinated by a remark made by Novalis in which Novalis said that Goethe's fairy tale of the green snake and the beautiful lily is narrated opera. Not opera in a total musical form, but narrated opera, Novalis tells us, spoken opera. This emphasis on the musical nature of Goethe's fairy tale and the importance of music generally in the mood of fairy tale is significant. Music and fairy tale are related. Now, let's turn to an example, the Novalis fairy tale Hyacinth and Rosebud, which is found in the book The Apprentices of Sais, and if we do so, maybe you will get a better idea of what I mean. When we studied this fairy tale in our group, we approached it in a musical way, and by that I mean we never begin our work with fairy tale from an intellectual space. We always start in the heart realm of art, poetry, and music. As we know, Rudolf Steiner made many important remarks about the significance of fairy tales, and perhaps for us at this time of challenge and crisis, we have the indication that fairy tales can help counter illnesses. But of course, one of the most liberating insights of Novalis, which Rudolf Steiner then develops later, is that the fairy tale is not just for children. Usually, when I tell acquaintances that I am making fairy tale videos, they smile and go, "Oh, well, that's nice, Bruce. I'll give them to my grandchildren." But these tiny narrated operas are for adults. Every adult needs to hear a true fairy tale in the right way, especially now. We hear so many bad and mangled fairy tales. Gosh, we wallow in them. They're all over the social media, everywhere. But every adult has a child inside, a child who needs to hear the true fairy tale repeatedly. But maybe the adult doesn't let the child listen to such stories. Oh my, how sad. The adult would rather explain the deep, hidden meaning in the fairy tale and say wise things, or teach lessons, or talk about evil. But the child only wants to enjoy a narrated opera. Here's a picture by William Blake. And imagine while you look at this picture by William Blake, and Blake and Novalis, by the way, have a lot in common. They were contemporaries, as you know, and we've spent a lot of time on Blake in our section meetings. Now, as you're looking at this picture, imagine that you too are carrying on your shoulder a child such as this. Is the child happy, sad, frightened, worried, angry, sick? Is the child having a fit, or maybe is it afraid of the world and terrified because all you tell it is bad stories or conspiracy theories? Are you mean to the child, or critical, or pedantic, or moralistic? Fairy tales and sagas are comparable to a good angel, granted human beings as a companion from birth on their life wanderings, to be a trustworthy comrade throughout, offering comradeship and making life inwardly into a truly ensouled fairy tale. I just want to linger for a moment on that last phrase. a truly ensouled fairy tale. There is, I think, hardly a better definition of magical idealism than this. Life might become, or perhaps should become, a truly ensouled fairy tale, or as Novalis also calls it, a novel. That is to say, a work of art, a work of poetry. Goethe had this idea also. Magical idealism is, of course, a term and concept used by Novalis quite often to explain the spiritual path of the poet. And for Novalis, any free and ethical human being who has awakened to the reality of the spirit is a poet. Poet, for Novalis, means that a human being is spiritually awake. The fairy tale that we are appreciating tonight, Hyacinth and Rosebud, is an excellent illustration of magical idealism, one might argue. And it's a splendid example of how a human being can wake up. In it, the hero of the tale, Hyacinth, undertakes a magical idealist enlightenment quest, much like the hero Heinrich in Heinrich von Ofterdingen, who searches for the blue flower. In both works, Novalis shows us imaginatively, using the medium of fairy tale, the healing path of magical idealism. The fairy tale Hyacinth and Rosebud is found almost right in the middle of The Apprentices of Sais. And that's a book which is filled with brainy conversations about nature and the relationship of the human being to nature. Nature and loving poetic appreciation for nature is, of course, very important to Novalis and to Goethe and to Rudolf Steiner. Nature enlivens us with the proper mood for the fairy tale, these folks would argue. Nature can heal and instruct us. But if we are chattering all the time like college sophomores excited about ideas and games of intellectual gotcha, well, then we don't have the quiet soul mood of awareness and sensitivity and artistic devotion to hear the soft healing voice of nature. We're more obsessed with maps of nature than the actual living experiences of nature. We're stuck, in other words, in the loud chatter of our narcissistic personalities. And the child on our shoulder gets bored or sick or has a fit or sulks and never speaks to us. That is why the fairy tale Hyacinth and Rosebud begins with the words, "Poor child who has not yet loved." Poor child. The hero of the fairy tale, whose name is Hyacinth, is a good illustration of this point. Hyacinth is a melancholic. He worries about this little nothing and that little nothing, Novalis tells us. And then one day, when a mysterious stranger, a grand master of occult lore and esoteric wisdom, and deep insights and high-flying philosophies. One day when this stranger arrives in town, Hyacinth immediately is besotted and fascinated. "Oh, tell me the deep secrets of creation. Give me the key to all mythologies. I want to join the secret society," Hyacinth pleads. So naturally, the stranger takes Hyacinth under his wing. "Follow me, grasshopper." And he initiates him into all sorts of occult lore and gives him many lectures. He even gives him a special book. It's the most special book ever. It's so special and so deeply cool and wise and awesome. And it contains such incredible secrets about creation that no human being can read it, Novalis tells us. Of course, Hyacinth is head over heels. He is totally besotted and ready to surrender himself to the master. "Oh, please, Master, guide me. I am unworthy. Direct my steps. Show me the truth," with a capital T. He wants the full course of instruction, all the secrets. Spare me no details. That's how I would feel. He wants the big diploma, the biggest diploma ever. He wants to belong to the most secret and most cool of all esoteric groups. But at the same time, he is miserable. And he becomes more and more miserable. In fact, he becomes so miserable that he loses interest in life. He turns his back on his sweetheart, Rosebud, and he suffers and grows depressed and estranged from the world. Then, Novalis tells us, in a stroke of good luck and karma, Hyacinth meets the wise old woman in the forest who says, "Show me that stranger's special book." And Hyacinth does. What does the old woman do? She burns the book. Right there in front of him. She burns it. She takes the most secret book of cool esoteric wisdom ever written, and she burns it. "No, no," cries Hyacinth. But she also gives him a good dose of enlightenment right on the spot at the same time. And the lad is changed forever. In other words, she breaks the spell of Hyacinth's enchantment and frees him for his individual quest. Hyacinth runs home and tells his parents he is leaving. He tells Rosebud he is leaving. So, you see, although he is freed from the glamour of the stranger's book, which he thought could substitute for lived experience, he is still in delusion about many things, and most of all about himself. But that is the nature of initiation or enlightenment. It proceeds by degrees, step by step. Just when you think you have it figured out, no, back to the beginning, back to once upon a time. You need the strength to be foolish in order to learn to herd the ox, as they say. So Hyacinth leaves home and begins his quest for the Great Mother, the goddess Isis, the veiled goddess who guards the true secret, the open secret of life and nature and human being. Hyacinth wanders about like a Parzival. His most important moments of learning and initiation occur when he keeps quiet and listens and remains all alone with himself and with nature. During those special moments, he sits down and shuts up. He's not like Faust in that regard. Faust hardly ever sits down and shuts up. But Hyacinth does, and he falls into the fruitful darkness of the questioning that guides the quest. He becomes like the Dumpkin character in fairy tales. You know, that third brother usually is the Dumpkin. Hyacinth listens to flowers. He listens to birds and clouds. He learns to sit still and breathe and pay attention to the inner world and to outer nature. He learns the art of boredom, and he begins to intuit the lemniscate that weaves between human being and so-called outer world. Like Parzival, really, like you know that story. Like Parzival dropping the reins of his horse and allowing the horse to find its way without interference, Hyacinth slowly becomes quiet enough and receptive enough and childlike innocent enough to find his way to the Grail. In this case, the Grail is the veiled goddess Isis. He arrives at the still center of the turning wheel. And what does he discover there? Well, now my introductory talk is over. And if you want to know what happens next to Hyacinth, you will need to watch the video of the fairy tale. Novalis will tell you everything you need to know. He doesn't need me. Novalis won't give you another stranger's book or even his own book. He will empower you to appreciate an open secret and go your own way and write your own book. As Novalis liked to say, where are we going then? Always towards home.